So I'm Edmund Malesky. I'm the director of the Duke Center for International Development and also the director of the Southeast Asian Research Group, which is sponsoring this event today, along with the Asian Pacific Studies Institute at the Duke Center for International Studies. We are delighted to have with us today Murray Hiebert. Murray is a senior associate of the Southeast Asia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Earlier, he served as a senior advisor and deputy director of the CSIS Southeast Asian program. Prior to joining CSIS, Murray was senior director for Southeast Asia at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And before that, he was a journalist in the China Bureau of the Wall Street Journal, the Far Eastern Economic Review, and he's the author of two very important books on Southeast Asia, on Chasing the Tigers, a book on Vietnam, and Vietnam Notebook. Murray, I should tell you that I read Chasing the Tigers on my first plane ride to Vietnam in 1997. So it sort of informed how I understand Vietnam today. So Murray and I have been exchanging emails, trading notes, and meeting at conferences for, I think, close to 20 years now. I'm just a huge fan of his work. Today, we're here to discuss Murray's new book, which is called Under Beijing's Shadow, Southeast Asia's China Challenge. It's a tour de force of a book. It weighs in at 600 pages. It covers every country in the region. It's just chock full of insightful comments, really interesting ideas, and just pretty much everything you need to know. I was telling Murray before this session that this book is going to become the ultimate reference book for people that want to start research projects on the relationship between China and Southeast Asia. I think it's going to be on everybody's desk, and we'll all be looking at it for a long time. I certainly know I will. So with that, I want to bring Murray in, and the way we've structured this today is to keep this a little bit more fun. I read Murray's book for the second time, and have sort of come up with a little way to do this as sort of an interview / dialogue. And we'll do that for about a half an hour. And then after that, I'll open this up to questions from the audience. Thank you so much for joining us today, Murray. It's really great to have you here.
Great, appreciate being here.
All right, so so Murray, why don't you just begin, tell us a little bit about your motivation for writing this book. At sometimes this book is personal. We talk about your own anecdotes in the region, and so what drove you to put together this important volume?
Well, so I lived in the region for a long time and really just saw China's rise. I actually opened the book with my first awareness of Southeast Asia and how the impact China had on it. I was an NGO worker at that point living in Laos in the late 70s, but I also had some responsibilities for Vietnam. And so I was in Vietnam, and suddenly at 3 o'clock or so in the morning, somebody banged on my door and said, "Do you want to go to Lang Son on the Chinese border?" And it was just a few weeks after China had invaded to teach Vietnam a lesson for Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia. And so I went and I saw, pretty thorough devastation. It had been obviously very, very brutal fighting. All the bridges were blown up, hospitals, schools, government offices, a lot of fields were burnt. I realized that sort of was like, aha, this is for real. And then, I lived in Laos for the next couple of years, but then saw also, increasingly China building roads in northern Laos. That was ultimately, to benefit its own access to Laos agriculture, mining, log, timber, that kind of stuff. And then from there, I moved to, I eventually morphed into journalism from NGO work. And I was living in Thailand when in the mid 80s, when China was arming the Cambodian resistance fighting against the Vietnamese. And at the same time, really doing a pretty good job of improving relations with the Thais, stepping up trade and trade activities, lot of stuff coming down beginning in 79, but I started to see it in the mid 80s. So then eventually I moved back to Vietnam as a journalist, and I'm there in 1991 when the Vietnamese party chief had to go to southern China to meet the Chinese party chief and other senior Politburo members to make peace. And that was a really big deal. Everybody in Hanoi was this, so they had been at odds from the mid 70s after Vietnam won the war against the US until 1991, till 1991. I watched that process, and then you very quickly started to see goods flowing across the border. Lots of things like plastic water buckets and pots and pans, and from Vietnam you'd see pigs and rice and stuff going on the long poles that the women carry and women and men carry. And later I moved to Malaysia, and then when I was actually in 1988, I was still in Thailand as a journalist, but China then attacked a Vietnamese outpost in the South China Sea. That was 1998. And it was a really brutal incident where the Vietnamese Navy was supplying this outpost and really wasn't armed. And the Chinese attacked and gunned down 64 Vietnamese sailors, something that you can easily find on YouTube yet. And so it was a bunch of incidents like that. And then I am working at CSIS in the from 2011 on, and in 2012 we saw the Chinese take Scarborough Shoal, a shoal occupied by the Filipinos forever, and a fishing place for them. And the U.S. tried to intercede and lost, and the Philippines was forced off. And then in 2013, China started to build artificial islands, which it militarized and put on runways and radar and artillery. And so then it was really while I was at CSIS and working on the South China Sea and at the same time watching China just explode and start doing Belt and Road and infrastructure projects everywhere, that it really, it hit me. And so, but as you know, Eddie, when you get into, I knew it was going to be a mother of all projects, but I didn't know I didn't intend it to be so windy. And I thought I would, but in the end, you sort of put down what you can find out. And so that's why it's so terribly long. And my style was, I am basically a journalist. I'm not an academic. So I read some academic stuff, but much of it is based on interviews in each of the countries.
I did want to talk about your method a little bit because, every page has 3 to 4 quotes from experts, from locals in the region, from people working for state-owned companies. How many interviews did you do that underlie this? Like, it's just incredible.
I didn't actually count. Some people do. It would have been really tough, but I don't know. Some countries were much easier. So Vietnam was quite easy. They saw the value of the book, as you would guess, as the country that has been affected most by China very directly, and it's China once occupied Vietnam for almost 1,000 years. I don't know. In each country, it was certainly dozens, but in a place like Vietnam, it might have been 150 or something. If you count everybody you talked to, from anybody that you had a conversation with seriously about China.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that I noticed about your style in this book is, like, you sometimes come in as a character yourself to sort of sometimes question, whether the aid data is correct or whether the investment data is correct, just based on your views on the ground, and I sort of like that sort of ground truthing some of what your experts were giving you. So it also sounds like there's also a really nice engagement with the academic and journalistic literature here too. So did you use that to inform your interviews? Did you sort of look at what the academics were saying? How did you balance that?
Yeah. So obviously it took about a little over 2 years to this project, and working on it mostly full time. I did a few other things, but mostly. And but if you start and I went back to most countries, the bigger ones, at least twice. In Vietnam, I think 3 or 4 times. But yeah, so they wouldn't be able to. They'd give me. It always would be a point in time that they. And so I needed, and I did a Google announcement. When you do a news announcement from Google, I'd had Vietnam, China, Vietnam, Brunei, Vietnam, and I would get a lot of stuff like that, or just some little thing, a little development that I wouldn't have picked up otherwise from some esoteric newspaper, that I would pick up this tidbit that could be very insightful, I thought. So it was a mix. And then the academic stuff, I just did searches and found, and some people I knew had written various things, so I would find their stuff or ask them for their stuff.
The other big choice that I wanted to, sort of ask you about before we get into the details of the book was the way you organized it, right? So you decided to do sort of an introductory chapter that covers the main themes and patterns, and then after that, individual country studies. And I'm interested why you chose that style of organization as opposed to like a more thematic, like I'm going to do Belt and Road and do all the the Southeast Asian countries and their interactions with the Belt and Road approach.
So I actually started organizing it thematically, doing exactly that: military ties, the ethnic Chinese, trade, investment, etc., Belt and Road. Spat in the South China Sea. But I realized that absolutely every country had a very different relationship. And if I thought of describing the Belt and Road, and then let's say the high-speed railroad, and do all the countries involved, I thought it would be just too confusing. Yeah. I just thought it wouldn't work. And I thought with doing countries, but with, like I compared what the Thais did with the railroad to the Lao, for example, or, the differences between the way Indonesia and Malaysia dealt with the railroad projects. But I don't, I just for comparison, but I thought to keep it all in one place, I thought people would, I found myself falling all over myself, tripping, that I just couldn't make it at all interesting and flowing.
Yeah, and I think as we get into the details, I think it will be clear because the policy, it's hard to come up with a single pattern because China's clearly got differentiated strategies for each of the Southeast Asian countries, and their responses are also quite different, even though the stimulus might be the same. Yeah. There have been other big books on China and Southeast Asia, so Josh Kurlancic's Charm Offensive, and David Shambaugh has, looked at this in a number of different places. But what do you think differentiates your book from the previous work that came before?
Interesting.
I was wondering, right? Like this is really it seems to me that there's a couple of things that are quite new. So your book is really one of the first books to look at this in the Xi Jinping era.
Yes.
Right. And yes. then the second thing I think is quite different is it's not looking at it so much from a Chinese perspective, but from a Southeast Asian perspective as well. And I just thought, were those intentional choices?
Absolutely. I thought, look, I spent over 20 years living in Southeast Asia. I've lived in 5 of the countries that are in the book. And I know this far better. And I could have a sense of how people felt about it. And I know others write about it from the point of view of China, but it's a little bit, like writing about I know nothing about Latin America, but writing about Latin America, from the American point of view is very different than if you look at how Brazilians or Argentinians or whoever view America. And so it was very much intended to tell the story of how Southeast Asians feel, although and perceive this, although I did try occasionally when I had quotes from them, or I did interview, I should add, I did interview Chinese. I interviewed twice their Vietnam expert, their Philippines expert, their Indonesia expert, and their Malaysia expert. And I hope I don't have any, casts or Chinese officials on the call, but it was a little bit interesting. But I finally said to the person on Vietnam, and it caused her to laugh. I said, I took a riff on a book that Mike Lampton did, Same Bed, Different Dreams. And I said, you and I sleep in the same bed, but we describe totally different dreams. Your Vietnam is different than my Vietnam. And she's lived there and, for like 8 years or something. And I realized also, and that was after I basically finished the book, that sometimes when you ask, and this as an academic too, that when you ask questions and they view you from a certain point, they view me as let's say the Vietnamese think I would be pro-Vietnam rather than pro-China. They're going to answer in that vein. However, if they think you're Chinese and they don't know who you're going to report to, they might just give you a different answer. Yeah. So I really, I did not find it insightful. And that was very disappointing to me, that it was very disappointing to not be able to, put some Chinese views into here, because they just weren't helpful.
So like they weren't informative, or they were sort of party line, or they didn't seem to be very analytical. It's like what, and I'm also interested in like, what was the Chinese dream? Like if you were having different dreams, like what was theirs? I'm so curious. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's say just take the case of Vietnam, because I spent the most time on that one with the Chinese. That person's, and I don't doubt that this person is a good scholar and knows a lot about Vietnam. She knew a lot about Vietnam. So I would talk about the South China Sea and how the Vietnamese felt about that. And she'd look at me and, obviously they recognize that we have a lot of claims, and it's historically ours. That's garbage, but or on the aid. So like the South China Sea, that is what inflames the population, right? And she didn't get that. It just was, her perception wasn't that at all. Or on some of the big projects, like the SkyTrain in Hanoi. I said, that's just a disaster. And it's corrupt, and it's
not done, not complete.
And it's not been done in 10 years. It's still not complete. You're like, what is going on? And she said, that's a party-to-party project, and we gave them loans. And there wasn't enough seriousness. And she agreed that there wasn't enough seriousness, but she didn't see it as a big eyesore that would get the Vietnamese very frustrated.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah. So, and then on this question of like really being the first book to look at this from in the Xi Jinping era, what do you think is like the big changes that you have noted from the way that people describe this from earlier Chinese administrations, from the perspective of Southeast Asians? Are they noting a shift in policy?
Yeah. They notice, for example, the China's more assertiveness in the South China Sea. They note that it started a little bit before, around 2009 or so. It started, so it's a little before, 3 or 4 years before Xi. The Belt and Road, even though that also started a few years technically, but it really took off under Xi, where he saw the advantages. and then also we haven't talked about the Mekong, but China in its own territory is building a bunch of dams, and he pushed really, to get a lot more done on those dams. They now have 11 completed. That and as we read in the newspapers now, the shortage of electricity in China, that's hurting the big cities. It's hurting manufacturing. You can see what he was trying to do.
Yeah.
It's just a little bit tougher, a little bit more arrogant, a little bit more cocky, a little bit more, we're the big guys on the block. And, you really should, you don't have to exactly go back to the old days of homage and stuff, but, you could just, you don't have to be vassal states, but you could just be a little more deferential. Let us decide a few things instead of kicking back at us on everything.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to get into the details right now, but before I do, I wanted to give you one chance to say what you want people to remember from this book, like the key messages that you think when people think about Under Beijing's Shadow that they're gonna remember with them. Like, so when I want to drop that I read this book at a cocktail party, what should I say to impress the host?
Oh golly. I don't know if this will work at a cocktail party. It depends if they're a bunch of Southeast Asianists. If they're agronomists, they're not going to find this interesting. Sorry. But I think I'm just trying to talk about how countries in China's immediate neighborhood are responding to the China had been rising, but the big almost explosion that happened. And I guess, to say that they're all a little bit different. Obviously, countries that are further away than on the border can get away with more. Little countries have less agency than big countries like Indonesia. But that China is having a heck of a time doing a bunch of this. It's Belt and Road, which it gets trumpeted as everything the Chinese announced. It almost sounds like it's already been completed. Well, usually it hasn't even been signed, for heaven's sake.
Yeah.
And it's having a lot of problems in every single country. And they came up with Laos was the first to work on this, but they negotiated for 5 years. Tiny Laos did not agree on the economic terms, did not agree how much. China wanted big swaths of land on each side of the railroad. They did not agree with that. And the Lao could push back, which stunned me. I thought they would just roll over these little countries. But once you get into it, talk to the locals about it, it's complicated. And China has not had an easy time anywhere.
That's really interesting. Actually,
they also, I just like to finish by just saying
go ahead. Yeah.
That the same time, they appreciate China for what it's doing. The trade, they've gotten a lot more cheap consumer goods. They're getting some more investment, which they like, because Americans, that is a very different style, right? Xi Jinping can order a state-owned enterprise to invest in it, Yeah. President Biden couldn't tell anybody to even go to Vietnam, let alone to do anything. It's just a different economic system with state-owned enterprise versus very free market. But there's a lot they appreciate about the Chinese. And when you talk about the Chinese, you also talk about the Americans. And then, America's far away, and America pays attention sometimes and not other times. And America is not this just great country, very very benevolent, just going to take care of us. It's complicated, and as they get into the Chinese and Americans go at it, it's very complicated for countries to figure out how they should respond.
Yeah, I think that comes across very strongly in your book, that there's the policy of the US towards Southeast Asia is changing from Bush to Obama, from Obama to Trump, and that Southeast Asian countries that are trying to position themselves or trying to triangulate aren't always clear where the US stands or how much the US will be supporting them, and that affects their ability to make commitments to the United States.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So okay. So there was a lot there that I want to follow up on, but I'll do it as we sort of move through the talk. So like in that first chapter, you kind of distinguish the Southeast Asian countries along two dimensions. So like you first sort of distinguish them along their physical proximity. So these are the sort of the further you get away from China, the more you have a different type of relationship with them. And I sort of get, but the second one is more interesting to me. You sort of distinguish them between those that are more aligned with China, and then the hard balancers and the soft balancers, so I'm sort of curious about, exactly what you meant by those terms, and then also like how you made the distinction to put them in these different camps. Like what was how did you make that choice to say that this country is a hard balancer versus a soft balancer?
I mean, it was not totally scientific. It was somewhat subjective. And actually, while I was reading the book, the countries moved sometimes.
Yeah, that's the tough part, is it's a moving target.
Yeah, because people have changed for various reasons. But, obviously some countries that are small, like Cambodia and Laos, that need a lot of economic development. Not that what China's doing is very good. We could talk about Laos for 3 days. I think it's just miserable what the Chinese are up to. Mm-hmm. And then you have countries that have a lot of experience with China. That includes both Vietnam and Myanmar. Myanmar now is back having to be, because of the coup and February 1st, has to be beholden to some extent. But the Chinese and the Myanmar military do not like each other. They've been going at it for decades through the proxies of the ethnic minorities, armies. And then you have the Thais. I don't know if there's a single country that feels so comfortable with the Chinese, and part of it is because 40% of Bangkok is ethnic Chinese. And so they feel very, very comfortable. They also feel like they have buffers around them. The Chinese can't do much, but they also don't let the Chinese have an easy time of it. That they have been negotiating they started very soon after the Lao agreed to begin the railroad, but the Chinese and the Thais have had over 30 rounds of negotiations, and they haven't gotten to yes. They're building a very short pilot project is all they have agreed to. And then when you get further away, Malaysia feels quite comfortable. They were the first to normalize with China in 1974. And, they've had prime ministers who've been really open. And the last one, until 2018 was Razak Baginda, who was not Razak, that's somebody else, Najib Razak, yeah. Who had this very corrupt investment scheme called 1MDB, and he needed Chinese help to buy some of the assets that were really tanking. And so he found ways to get the Chinese to help him. And in the end, he got defeated, and his successor, the former Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad, just laid everything out that he had done and canceled the project until China renegotiated. Mm. But then you have the funny case of where Philippines has been a colony of the U.S., is a formal ally of the U.S., but has had all its tensions over bases back in the 90s, and a lot of protests against the Americans and for various things. But yet the military has a very close tie with the U.S. Partially, they needed the U.S. to fight against Islamic terrorists, the Abu Sayyaf and others. And so the military is very close, but their president, Duterte, the guy who was elected in June of 2016, he was very mad at Obama because Obama and the State Department criticized him on his war on drugs, which was very brutal. Thousands died. And so he just said, screw this, I'm off to China. So in the Great Hall of the People, he announces he's separating from the United States and be a friend of China forever. Then he signs $24 billion worth of agreements. And now, 6 years later, he's almost ready to leave office. He's already a lame duck. And he has gotten 2 small bridges worth a couple of $100 million. He's gotten none of the big projects. What happened? I don't know. It's complicated. We could talk about it, but China may just have decided you fell all over yourself being so nice to us that we got everything we're ever going to get from you.
Right.
So,
yeah. And Duterte himself can be a bit of a wild card.
Yeah.
In terms of these countries that are changing their positions and forcing you to have to rewrite your books and your lecture notes, he's definitely a leader that does that. So, so in this discussion, I think it came up, and this sort of is something that's sort of reinforced in the book, is, there's sort of a couple of recurring interactions that these states have. And I'd like to go through, 3 of them, just sort of, like in more detail. So the first one that's come up is is the Belt and Road program, and the second is the Mekong River and the debates over the Mekong River, and the third is the debates over the South China Sea.
Okay.
So there's a whole bunch of others. You deal with soft power and you deal with military engagement, but those are 3 sort of recurring themes, and they sort of structure the interactions, a lot of the interactions we see right now. So, and in this discussion right now, as you were organizing these countries, it's clear that Belt and Road informs a lot of how you think about these interactions. So maybe we could just talk about this a little bit. So I think most everybody on this call knows a lot about, Belt and Road from the American perspective, about what's going on in the Chinese perspective, but maybe you could tell us a little bit about, how Southeast Asian countries view this and how they're benefiting from it, and also how they might be a little bit afraid about what's going on too.
Yeah, that is it is a good way to talk about this, about China and how the Lao, the Chinese offered them a railroad that would ultimately run from Kunming in China to through Thailand, Bangkok, through Kuala Lumpur to Singapore, which would really be an amazing route for tourists and shipping cargo. And they started proposing this, but the Lao, they wanted the Lao to pay for this thing, almost $7 billion, which their GDP back about in the 2010 or so 11 period was around 14, 15. It's now around 17 or 19 billion. So that was crazy. And they didn't see a lot of benefit for themselves anyway. But they, the Chinese also offered interest rates of 4 or 4.5%. It's sometimes really hard to figure out the interest rate, but all of Chinese Belt and Road projects are loans from either the Exim Bank or the China Development Bank, and they usually start negotiating at 4 or 4.5%. If you go to a Western bank, Citibank, well, I don't know if they do infrastructure, but they're gonna, the investment banks start around 2% for a country. So, and the Japanese come in at 0.7%. So that the countries feel that China, so I asked the Chinese, what the heck? And they say, well, Exim and their Exim and the China Development Bank are money-making banks. So they have to make money off these projects. And then with the Thais, they had a lot of problems with the project. The Malaysians finally, the Laos kind of came to an agreement, and it'll be finished at the end of this year. But it's an amazing project. It'll hit the Mekong this year, but it's an amazing project. I went and looked at these guys, these Chinese engineers blasting through mountains. It was unbelievable. So there's actually the surrogated or whatever line is the Chinese railroad. And yeah, and it's going through mountainous terrain, and some of the mountains that they can go like maybe 3 meters a day with their electronic computerized digital drilling machines. It's really tough slog.
Wow.
And they're trying to keep the railroad straight, and so they drill through the mountain, and then when they're in the valley, they put up struts, and so that the railroad is basically going straight through the mountainous area. It's amazing. But I was going to talk a little bit about Laos. So Thailand, the Thais, they also asked the Thais for 4.5%, and the Thais said, "Well, we can do it much cheaper. Screw that." They also said, the Thais said, "We want to use some of our own engineers." The Chinese try to bring in their own engineers. They've got a glut of engineers, so they would like to get them all jobs. Part of the Belt and Road is too many people that need jobs, too much steel and too much cement and too much cash. So there's lots of reasons for these big projects.
So you do make a point in the book that a lot of times the stick up is the Chinese engineers, the contractors, the Chinese want to use their own labor, even at the rudimentary level. And this is something that is a concern for a lot of the countries in Southeast Asia.
They'd like some jobs out of this too. Yeah. And so the Thais are caught up in knots in this. They wanted, they told the Chinese, let's bid for the cheapest, best infrastructure. China said, no, let's just use ours. The Thais said, we have to really do, we've been influenced by the Japanese. We need to do environmental assessment studies, economic impact studies. And the Chinese said, well, we could just start building and we can do the study as we're going.
Yeah.
How are you going to reverse that if you do that, right? If you, and the Chinese have learned a little bit from this already. Xi Jinping in 2019 had a conference where he said, we've got to get more green, less polluting projects. We've got to have less corruption. We've got to be more transparent on what we're actually doing. So they're learning from it. And, how would they know unless they try some of this stuff, I guess. The other example I will give is Indonesia. So in Indonesia, which had a coup in 1965 that a lot of people, Indonesians, blame on the Chinese Communist Party. There's some doubt, and it was instigated by the CIA. There's lots of both countries get some blame for this thing, and up to 400,000 or 500,000 people died. But there's been a lot of anti-Chinese feeling in Indonesia that doesn't exist, for example, in Thailand, where they're so integrated into society. And so when Suharto was toppled in 1998, there were ethnic anti-China riots. And even now, when Chinese are involved in projects, in one project that's in Sulawesi in the far southeast of the country, very remote, there are protests by students against Chinese miners. They say, what the heck, they don't need to do this, we can do this. Yeah. But what Jokowi recognized this, and when he ran, the current president, Joko Widodo, when he was running in 2014, he was accused of, he is a Muslim, he's a furniture salesman, but when he was running, they accused him of being a Christian, they accused him of being a Chinese, and so he has to be a bit careful. And so he has the Chinese way out in the periphery. He keeps them totally out of Java, the most populous island where close to half the population lives and probably half the GDP. But he keeps them in Kalimantan, the island, Borneo, the southern part of Borneo that they share with Malaysia and Brunei, Sulawesi in the south, Sumatra way in the west. And he doesn't, where they're building dams and doing special economic zones.
we put the map up in front of you, so this might make it easier for you to gesture about. Yeah.
Well, you have Indonesia in the south, and Sulawesi is that weird Halloween-like looking figure at the bottom, and then Kalimantan is that big island right in the middle of the map, a little lower, and then Sumatra is the one next to Malaysia. The peninsula that comes down is Sumatra. So it keeps what Jokowi does. He keeps the Chinese away from having any big political soft power role. And really, the only thing they're doing in Java is building the Bandung to Jakarta railroad, which is only 90 kilometers long.
I see.
So and that's really unique. The Vietnamese are also unique in that they basically keep all the big infrastructure projects out of their country. Period.
Yeah, yeah.
Even Myanmar, under the military and under Aung San Suu Kyi before the coup, really was very reluctant. They shut down various Chinese projects, had big protests against them. Yeah. So it is a battle.
So in some people say that a dispute over the dam between the military and China might have been one of the impetus for Myanmar's opening up in 2008 in the first place. I've definitely heard that before. Yeah,
the Mistone Dam that is on the it's sort of the source of two major rivers that are sort of the lifeline, that people view them for lifeline for agriculture, and a lot of symbolism for the founding of the country and all that. Yeah, it was right on there. China wasn't very sensitive to that.
So I do want to ask you about debt traps, but I'm conscious of time because this is a term that gets associated with the Belt and Road, and it's very controversial, and that's something that China has rejected, but other countries have accused China of. But let's table that for a second. Xiaojun, can you put back up the map of the South China Sea, because that's the second question. This has been a big issue, and this gets into the some of the issues that Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia have had with China. So, tell us a little bit about this set of interactions and why they've been controversial, Murray.
Yeah, this is one of two very big flashpoints right now in Southeast Asia. So you see the dotted line that goes up from the southern China, around Vietnam, around Malaysia, and up here past Indonesia, or that's actually Borneo, it's part of Malaysia, and then up past the Philippines and near Taiwan. And then I don't know if you can see them, but there are white lines. You have a white series of lines. That's Vietnam's exclusive economic zone. The lines around Malaysia, the lines around the Philippines are their economic zones. And some of the lines between there are four major disputing countries: China, Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines. Brunei has a minor claim. Indonesia doesn't have any claims, but the Chinese often show up at Natuna, which has both lots of oil. It's in the far northwest of Indonesia, and it's the islands in the well, I'm getting too technical, but it is on the map. So the grouping of islands in the middle are called the Spratlys. Vietnam actually controls about 21 of those islands. China about, well, what is it now, 7 or 8. Malaysia also about that number. And then the islands in the north are the Paracel Islands, just south of Hainan Island. Those are the Paracels are islands that China took from the old South Vietnamese government in 1974 when the Americans were still there. So the South China Sea has a couple of real importances. One is a lot of their testosterone, I guess. I guess females care about this too, but a lot of the issues that that are keeping the countries apart are wrapped up in the South China Sea. For nationalism reasons, Vietnam has regular protests against China. Malaysia plays it much cooler. The Philippines also has protests against China. And it's nationalism and it's their history, but it's also inside their exclusive economic zone are tons of hydrocarbons. And all Vietnam, Malaysia, Malaysia is actually some of their exclusive economic zone is above Borneo, that island, right in the middle of the map, a little below center. And there's a lot of oil and gas there. And then the Philippines also has considerable gas, maybe some oil also. And they need this right now for firing up their economies. It's either going to be gas or it's going to be coal. And we know what coal's going to do to climate change. So they really want to use it. But China in recent years has started to really harass countries a lot. So for the last, not this year, but for the last 3 or 4 previous years, China would have its Coast Guard. Actually, I'm going to back up just a little bit. So since 2012, when China took the Scarborough Shoal, which is just off the right bank of the Philippines, actually to the north too, it started building artificial islands. It has 7 now that are Fiery Cross and Mischief Reef and a couple of others that have been militarized. They have landing strips for big military jets. They have harbors for big naval vessels, and artillery, surface-to-air missiles, and radar, and all that, and resupply facilities. So China, Vietnam has oil and gas exploration going on off the coast of the Mekong in the south. China, they have to go all the way back to Vietnam to resupply. And China just has to go to one of the dark dots are really, the darkest dots are Chinese islands. They have to only go there to resupply, so they can harass the dickens out of these guys for 3-4 months at a time. So they did that in 2020, 2018, 2019, for 3 or 4 years before the current year. And then off the coast of Malaysia, they did that those same time, but they're also doing it now. They've been going on for months, harassing, and Malaysia's closest partner out in that area is Shell. And so they're taking on a Western oil company. And then off the Philippines, they have is Reed Bank, where Philippines have been trying to develop gas supplies since 2011 and are being really harassed. So what's going on has economic costs way beyond just the political costs.
Yeah. And
they do the same to Indonesia, but Indonesia is not really a claimant, but they still have disputes.
So there's an incident that you write quite eloquently about in the book a couple of times that's really enlightening because of its impact on Vietnamese domestic politics and Vietnamese relations with both China and the US. Is this incident of China moving the oil rig onto Vietnam's territorial shelf. So yeah, I think the audience would love to hear about what happened with that and how you think it reflects on sort of the larger sort of issues at play here.
Yeah. So and when you ask the Chinese, so what belongs to whom here? And they say all the hydrocarbons belong to us, but we would agree to let them develop them, but they have to do it with our oil and gas companies. They can't use, Exxon. They can't use Shell. They can't use Russian Rosneft or any of those. They need to use CNOOC or one of those. Our companies. But in the area that it says South China Sea there, the Chinese moved a giant oil rig in May of 2014. And that really was a wake-up call and a shocker to the Vietnamese. So they had huge protests, and they had nothing really to fight back with. So the Vietnamese just started to attack, and there's lots of video of this on YouTube. It's amazing. With their little wooden fishing boats, they would go ram into this thing, this big steel-hulled oil exploration rig. And it was like mosquitoes attacking a water buffalo. But in the end, the Chinese left early. They had planned to stay through into August, but they left, I think, at the end of July. So they were there about 2.5 months, something like that. And it was a huge wake-up call. And the Communist Party realized just how much the Vietnamese people care about this. It's a huge existential thing that they have against China. So yeah, that was a big deal.
Do you think it played a role in Vietnam being more open to some of the concessions that they had to make to enter the Trans-Pacific Partnership with the United States?
It could have been. Yeah, so I should have actually finished the story. So I got access for the book to previous Vietnamese communist leaders who dealt with China, and they were quite willing to describe what happened in the past. I couldn't go right up to the present. They said, "Come on, then we're going to betray who we are." The conditions were I couldn't identify their by name. But I could use their quotes. And they said what shocked the Communist Party of Vietnam is they have a hotline, and they would call the hotline and nobody would answer. Nobody would answer time and time again for weeks. They couldn't get an answer. That really was a wake-up call that our communist camaraderie only goes so far. Yeah.
So what do you think was the message that China was trying to deliver by moving the rig in? And why do it? Was it because of Vietnamese contracting with foreign contractors and not Chinese? Was it because of Vietnam filing claims under the law of the sea? Like, why? What was?
I think it was a little bit of all of it. You guys are upstarts. You should be working with us. You're trying to get in all these Western oil companies. It was a signal to all the claimants, Philippines and Malaysia also. It was that the hydrocarbons really are ours. We can share them, but you can't exclusively have them. It was also a step in China's just showing who's boss in the South China Sea. They were in the process then of rebuilding those islands, which they started in 2013. They finished in 2017. So this was a step in that process to send a signal. And then since they finished those islands, they've been using them to supply and harass, and when if that oil rig went in there again, China's since 2014, this is another thing that's changed under Xi Jinping. Well, maybe it's just something that happened coincidentally, but the Chinese Navy is, they've got now 2 aircraft carriers. They've got huge Coast Guard vessels. They use a strategy of Coast Guard vessels supported by maritime militia vessels that are sort of look like fishing vessels, but they're not. There's no fishermen on there. And they can really, earlier this year, they were off a reef off the Philippines for months called Whitsom Reef. The Filipinos said they had over 200 ships there at one time, occasionally, quite often, for months. It's just showing that this is ours. And then they also block fishermen, which is another thing, because everybody is fishing the dickens out of the South China Sea, because as people get richer, they want more protein. And there's not a lot of respect for the fish. Everybody's overdoing it.
Yeah. I mean, you do make the point in the book. You talk to some American military officials who talk about that the US used to do these freedom of navigation operations through here, but that, it is at the point right now where China is in a position militarily in the South China Sea that they effectively control it militarily. It would be very difficult.
If China said we want to control the South China Sea militarily, short of an all-out war, it would be very hard for the US to seize it back. Yeah, and they're just pushing increasingly sophisticated technology out there. There is a guy for CSIS, Johns Hopkins in Washington, who has done a lot of work on this, on the Chinese modernization of the Navy. I can't remember his name off the top of my head right now, but if somebody needs that, it is really amazing what they're doing. I could get you his name and email address and stuff. Yeah.
I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience, Murray, but I do want to talk about one thing that's really special about your book that just doesn't get profiled a lot in other sort of discussions or commentary on this, which is these disputes over the Mekong River. And they might themselves be even more existential than the other two, than the South China Sea. So tell us a little bit about what's going on the Mekong River, what the disputes are, and how Chinese development has altered these relationships.
So this is just the upper. It's a map of only Laos, but I thought it so. Even since I had these maps put together, so the part in the gray area in the left side of the top, those are Chinese dams. They now have 11 of those. And what is happening with those dams? They hold back. Did a group called Eyes on the Sky and Stimson Center here in Washington did satellite aerial photography and managed to see how much, because so the lower Mekong was having a severe drought and they couldn't figure out what the heck. And the Chinese said, we're also suffering from a drought. And then when they took the aerial photographs, they then, there are ways they can measure roughly how much water is in each of these. And the 11 dams had enough water to fill the Chesapeake Bay, the bay that's quite close here to Washington. And that's a huge bay, obviously. And so China built its own dams. Then it is helping Laos build dams. So some of the dams in the Laos area, actually we're not quite up to date here. It only shows the Sayaburi Dam is black. The others are still under construction. Some of those are completed, and then it goes down, the Mekong goes down to Cambodia. So China is helping build dams and in Laos as well, but so are the Thais and the Vietnamese and the South Koreans and the Malaysians. Everybody wants a piece of the pie. What the damage of these dams is that for the last 3 years, this area has had severe drought, including this year. So the dams hold back water, which obviously there's 65 million people that make their livelihoods along the river fishing and growing vegetables or growing rice. And they, with this water shortage, their livelihoods are being really dinged. The other thing that happens is a lot of the fish move up and down the Mekong to spawn. And with the dams, there's no fish ladders. And actually, people tell me fish ladders don't work. I'm no expert, but the fish can't spawn. The other thing that happens is that there's no silt. And the silt has been a big deal. It comes as the ice melts in the Himalayas, where the Mekong begins and then flows 2,700 kilometers down to the South China Sea in Vietnam. It drops silt along the way, and this is very fertile for growing crops, truck crops, garden crops, and rice. And then when the time it gets to Vietnam, the Mekong Delta in Vietnam is below sea level. And if they don't have silt, the South China Sea, the salt water from the South China Sea invades way into the Mekong Delta. And as Eddie probably hears when he goes to Vietnam, that it's now going in 20, 30 kilometers into the Mekong Delta, which is Vietnam's rice basket. And it's going to ultimately really destroy food production. It'll become a security issue because you're going to have maybe 14, 15, 20 million people leaving the Mekong if it does fall under the South China Sea. And where are they going to go in a very densely populated country, in a very densely populated area generally? Yeah, so the Mekong is a big deal, but they don't know what to do with it because China does these things. They ask China to please share water data, what they're doing, and China sort of yes, but doesn't do very much. So this is a flashpoint that hasn't started flashing yet, but I think it's going to become a real big issue. Sorry, Eddie, I cut you off.
Oh, no, I was gonna agree with you on the food security issues and what is gonna happen with climate migration, environmental migration. I mean, Vietnam is not prepared for what could happen, and it's and resolving this issue, I think, is key. So now the way you describe it, part of it is just these are the dams and this is what's happening. There's also a security issue here. There's an issue of control too, right? China can at a time determine that it wants to push water through this system, and or China can, for its own energy needs, decide to retain that water for and create all sorts of problems downstream. And it appears right now there's not an organization that is able to deal with that either, right?
The Mekong River Commission, which was set up and then reformatted and set up again, China is not a member of it. It's only the U.S. and Japan are observers, and then it's the Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, and Cambodia are members. They can do research, but they have no ultimate clout to force China to do anything. Then China has set up its own organization through which it gives some aid, but it's ironic that the aid they're giving is far smaller than the damage they're doing to farmers downstream. So they're a little unimpressed with that. But and Laos, it's really time to stop building these dams. Each of these dams costs, at least in Laos, Cambodia, they cost about $2 billion. And there is now the Thais, who are it's the country in the bottom here on the south, on the left bottom. They no longer, their population has turned environmentalist and no longer want hydropower. So they want renewables and wind and solar. And so there's a big argument to be made that Laos, it wants to be the battery of Southeast Asia. That's fine, but it should look elsewhere besides dams and maybe stop building dams, which are really destructive, and do solar and wind in this. It's a very mountainous, underpopulated country that has lots of land that could be on which, and with the price of solar and wind dropping so quickly, and Vietnam and China both being major producers of solar panels, they could easily pivot and have less destruction on the ecosystem of the Mekong.
And to be fair, it's not just China that's building these dams. As you said, the domestic countries are, and the World Bank has been involved in the Siberi Dam right there, right? So
yes.
So there's been others have been involved.
Yes.
Yeah. So okay, let me I have some questions from the audience, and then I have a few more questions of my own. So we have Don Nannini is an anthropologist from UNC Chapel Hill, and so he asks, he's reflecting on your point that you made, that you didn't find the Chinese views insightful. and he had two questions that were kind of a follow-up on that. How have you brought the locally born citizens of mainland Southeast Asia into your analysis? And how do you see the non-Chinese citizens of Southeast Asian countries reacting to the Chinese presence when they view their own locally born Chinese, when they view their own locally born Chinese diasporic populations? Just, I mean, you do reflect on that in the book a lot. So
right.
Yeah.
Every country's different again. So which ones do you want to cover? But
I think that, I think that it's interesting to talk about. I think Indonesia and Thailand offer really interesting contrasts here, I think, in terms of thinking, and maybe Malaysia too, in terms of thinking about this issue, because as Don probably knows, in Thailand, a lot of the ethnic Chinese took Thai surnames, they're integrated into the population, whereas Indonesia and Malaysia, they've remained relatively distinct even now. So, but that, so it might be interesting to compare those two.
Yeah. In a nutshell, the Chinese, there are two categories of Chinese that the Southeast Asian countries would talk about easily, identify. One is the old guys that have been there, let's say, since before, I guess they would say old guys are guys that came before World War II, and stayed. And then the new guys are the guys that started to come in the 80s and that really started to come in the 2000s. And the old guys are, except for Indonesia, where they're still not trusted. In Thailand, they're very integrated, and a lot of the big companies are ethnic Chinese. Central Department Store, CP, the big chicken guys. And they actually have the CP group actually has the first investment license ever given by the communist regime in China. And they were very big investors. They've now been overtaken by the Singaporeans, who are now the biggest investors. But the new guys really irritate the locals. They come in and they describe them as very arrogant, swagger around with their attaché cases full of US dollars and renminbi. They build casinos. And in places like Cambodia, the casino scene just really, it took over Sihanoukville until the Chinese asked Hun Sen, the prime minister, to stop them. And then he did. Interestingly, but it seems to be picking up again. But although there are no Chinese to go to the casinos because of COVID. And then in the Philippines, there is the Pogo, it's called, it's online gaming. And you have a monitor, television screen, and people are playing, showing cards and stuff, and you bet on this, and many of them are skimpily clad women, young women, but they're illegal in China. So you have to have an operation offshore. So that operation offshore finds ways to get money to payment agents in China who pay people for their bets and collect money if they've lost. But the areas that really worried me quite a bit is northern Laos and northern Myanmar. The northern swath of those two countries have largely been taken over by ethnic Chinese. The governments are very weak, and their writ doesn't really extend there, so they move in, or they just move in and set up rubber plantations, grow pumpkins and green beans, and you can see all this stuff very easily. A lot of it they're using a lot of dangerous chemicals, which are hurting the water and causing a lot of complaints, killing cattle, for example. And the same is true in Myanmar, where the government really just was not able to figure out, it just wasn't in control of their ethnic armed groups. And then the other thing up there is, of course, GEMS in northern Myanmar, which China is really involved in. The two militaries, the ethnic armed forces, and then a lot of just freelance miners are really mining in very dangerous conditions. Often there's collapse of little villages and stuff. But they send all these gems to China. Most of the rest of the world has turned off on the gems. The U.S. it's illegal to import Burmese gems into the U.S.
Well, they're a huge concern right now after the coup. I mean, that's a major source of, hard currency, keeping the military alive right now, in the presence of all these sanctions.
And Congress has just introduced a new Burma Act early this week. And there's many elements, but one of them is make sure we keep the gems out.
Mm-hmm. The first thing that the military did was they made sure that the annual gem convention after the coup was not canceled. It was it continued to take place in Naypyidaw.
They also have a auction center there, and they also have a gem museum, the whole business, right? Mm-hmm. So in Cambodia was the only place where I found the young guys really do irritate a lot out of the population, but the older guys, they're often intermediaries, and that's the only country in which I found the Chinese playing that role, because the Chinese often come in with giant state-owned enterprises, and so if you're a little ethnic Chinese with a little company, there's no way you can become a partner of these guys. In Malaysia or Indonesia. In Indonesia, you're starting to have some very big Chinese companies. You've long had very big Chinese companies, but the Jokowi's plan is, I didn't talk about this, but he doesn't want his state to have any debt to China. Mm-hmm. So he forces state-owned enterprises to have joint ventures with Chinese state-owned enterprises, which is really a recipe for having economic collapse if these guys all become over-leveraged, which has been a concern. Let's see, what else should I, the other place that when Cambodia shut down the online gaming stuff at the request of the Chinese, it moved across the border into Myanmar from into the Karen area across from Mae Sot in Thailand. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the gaming happens now right in Thailand, on the border. I'm not quite sure. In Vietnam, there's very few ethnic Chinese left. They're mostly integrated into the economy, and some of them do. Oh, the other thing that a lot of Chinese do that are locals are set up tourist companies. So tour companies, Chinese are becoming increasingly important as tourists. They're by far the biggest group now in Thailand and in a lot of these countries. And tourism drives about 25% of the Thai GDP. So it's a big deal now that it's been cut off with COVID. It's really pretty difficult. Lots of thousands, tens of thousands of people have lost their jobs. But when tourism still worked, they would set up the bus company that brings the people from the airport. They'd build little hotels here and there. They'd have guides and restaurants, and they would be, and so the locals call these $0 tourists because they work only with fellow Chinese. They don't work with the locals, and they feel like they're getting a raw deal from that.
Yeah. So Murray, I have 3 more questions here from the audience. So one is actually a question, we sort of touched on this just a little bit when we were talking about the gems. It comes from one of our star students here at Duke from Myanmar. And she says, as a student from Myanmar, I'd like to ask a question for your kind answer. So you've mentioned that the Myanmar military and Chinese government, don't have the same sort of relationship. It's been a complicated relationship, especially during the Thein Sein administration. And she says, what's your opinion about Beijing future communication and backstopping the Myanmar military government after the coup? And she's particularly interested in China's interest in natural resources, as well as China's interest in that gas pipeline.
So the pipeline, goes. So I show from Kunming, which is on the right side of the map, is the beginning of the railroad that China wants to build in Myanmar, but that's still notional. But they built two pipelines, oil pipeline and a gas pipeline that go down here to Chakpyu. And that's where China also wants to build a big port that some people fear might be used for dual purpose, because this is Rakhine State here, where a lot of the Rohingya were kicked out of in 2017 and 18. It's not a very populous state, and there's no industry there. The industry is down on the far south in Yangon, Mandalay, those areas. And one of the concerns of the military, they've asked the Chinese, they've asked the Myanmar military several times to make sure they protect the pipeline, because it gets around. Otherwise, China has to, the Chinese vessels or the vessels supplying China have to go all the way around Straits of Malacca, Singapore, and then come up, and it's to Western China, and it's Eastern China, and that's a real much longer route. China has had, the local population, especially early on, blamed China for a lot of what was happening. China, no doubt, provided some of the technology for monitoring protests and protesters. But interestingly, so the Myanmar military and the Chinese military and the government have long had not a very deep love relationship, because when I was interviewing for my book, I talked to military people and they said, yeah, we don't trust the Chinese. They arm the armed ethnic groups, the 16 or 20 groups that are fighting against us. And then the Chinese give the aid through the an ethnic group in northern Myanmar, very closely tied to the Chinese. They are a group of ethnic Chinese, and they supply us, and they use military equipment that we can't fight against. It's much more sophisticated. So we're getting killed by Chinese weapons by the ethnic groups. So that's a sticking point. The military had really nowhere to go, but China was less than 100% enthusiastic. They actually, when I was doing my book, the Chinese told me that one place, I didn't even mention this, one place you can get good information about Myanmar is Kunming. I forgot, they are really the best Myanmar watchers in the world. I forgot to mention them, sorry. I was talking about the others, but they, so they would say, the Chinese would say that they got along actually better with Aung San Suu Kyi than the military. If Aung San Suu Kyi said something, it sort of stuck. It sort of was, we made an agreement, we have to keep going. If we go with the military, they change their mind, and they're not very serious sometimes especially about economic development. And it was interesting that about a month ago, the Chinese special envoy for Myanmar came to Myanmar, and he was talking to the junta, and then asked them if he could see Aung San Suu Kyi, and they refused. And the fact that he asked to see Aung San Suu Kyi, I think, shows us that, yes, we know you, the military, won. You won the first days of the coup. You crushed the opposition totally, but now you are not in control of the country, because you have the protests, you have the rising military insurrection, small little military groups forming and attacking and killing local officials. They're blowing up bombs in Yangon and that kind of thing. And so I think the Chinese were saying that, you might need to do some political reconciliation of some kind. I don't know if they were saying you have to work with Aung San Suu Kyi, but they were really, the Chinese have sent messages that this is not your grandfather's coup. It didn't work very well.
Yeah.
And you're getting so much opposition, and it means it's destroying the economy. And we would like to see some kind of reconciliation. Maybe you should have a new election and give the civilians a role like they had in the previous end of the previous military government under Thein Sein from about 2010 to 2016. That period there, that's when a lot of the reforms happened. It became a much more friendly place for people. And that's when all the young people grew up, right? They started to realize they can have access to the internet and Facebook and all that stuff, have mobile phones. Yeah.
That's it. I really do think, like, if China can play that type of role, a constructive role, I think it would be a huge development in terms of resolving this conflict. That's a really telling anecdote. All right, I have a few more questions here. Actually, all of a sudden the questions are exploding with like 5 minutes left. So let me choose a few that I think you're gonna like, Murray. So we have one from Tianchan. What is the role of host countries' governments in the game of Chinese projects in Southeast Asia? Previous studies show that Chinese investment are more attracted to countries with abundant resources and poor political institutions in Africa. Do you think the Southeast Asian countries with poor political institutions or more corruption are more willing to invite Chinese investment at the cost of local welfare?
You want me to go?
Yeah, go ahead. Why don't you take that one, and then I've got one more.
Okay. I think maybe there's something to that, but I think they have been surprised at how sophisticated the Southeast Asians have generally been. That being, they got caught with their pants down in Malaysia when suddenly their patron, the guy who had got them to build the East Coast Rail Link for about a third more than it was worth, and they were siphoning money to him for his election campaign and to pay off his investment fund debts. And then that exploded on him. Even in a sophisticated Malaysia, the third largest GDP in Southeast Asia, I think.
Malaysia second, or GDP per capita?
Per capita, yeah. Per capita, it's second. Yeah. In terms of GDP, I think Thailand's higher, right?
Yeah. I think total size of the economy, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia.
Yeah. And so I don't think they found that, but the other thing, Laos, I could talk about. They took advantage of Laos, and they built a lot of infrastructure, the dams, the railroad, the Chinese-looking hotels along the Mekong. And at the end of it, about a little over a year ago, the electricity, EDL, which is their electricity company, this electricity utility that has been involved in dam building and other stuff, was so far in debt it couldn't make its interest payments. So that the Lao government spun off part of the EDL company into a group company called EDL Distribution, and turned over 90% of that company to Southern China Grid Company, effectively turning over the distribution to a Chinese company. And the world let it happen. I keep asking the Thais, the Vietnamese, the Americans, what were you doing? You let that happen on your watch. That they took advantage. That's Africa kind of example. We haven't, and Laos is really a huge debt levels, over 60%, 68% or something of their GDP, their foreign debt, and most of it to China. That's a bad example, but in the other countries found ways to push back and did not. Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar, under a lot of pressure, she just refused to sign the agreements. They're too big. We don't need these big projects. And that's really true of the Thais. The Indonesians also are very careful. So it's a mixed bag, but it's people are learning, and I think the Chinese are learning. I hope they're learning.
Okay, so I have a couple of congratulations here from one person that you know, I think Tien Bui from the Institute of Legal Studies in Vietnam on the book, and he's got some questions on the South China Sea for you. But we've covered that a little bit. I want to get to a question from Lucy Wright, who's a graduate student in political science. And I think we don't have too much time, but I think it's a fun question to go out on. So she says, you mentioned that in Cambodia, there's resentment among citizens of young citizens, especially ethnic Chinese in Cambodia. Meanwhile, the Cambodian government is among the closest allies of China, if not the closest ally in the region, as the Hun Sen regime has become increasingly reliant on Chinese aid and investment over the last decade. How do you perceive the disconnect between popular opinion and the regime's ever-growing proximity to China? Do you see this posing a challenge for the Hun Sen regime in the future? And I would say not just the Hun Sen regime, but of course, maybe also the Hun Sen family regime, because it looks like Hun Sen's preparing for a succession right now too. So,
yeah. You know, the interesting thing is that a lot of the strongest feelings that I found against China being too involved were from young people, as she points out. And you know, they just want to have a normal life. They don't want to have a dictator running their country, and they don't want the dictator to be propped up. Because Hun Sen really, you know, when he gets yelled at by the US for human rights violations, for having totally cooked elections, for throwing the leaders of the opposition in prison and making the rest flee the country, China will prop him up. So yeah, that could become an issue going forward, that China will realize that it can, if it props up these guys and they are toppled. I don't know. I would, you know, so you referred to the fact that Hun Sen wants his son Hung Mon-a to take over from him. You know, Hung Mon-a studied both in the US at West Point and studied in Nottingham University, I think in the UK. I think, you know, I know he knows what he's got to do to please his father and the hardliners, but I think he's a new generation, and he may be a little soft, may have a little rounder elbows and maybe a little softer and easing up on some of the draconian controls on journalists, on NGOs and that kind of thing. But it is very ironic. And Hun Sen will always say, the Chinese open a bridge, he'll invite the Chinese ambassador, and he always has the same speech. You know, I know there's people out here that criticize me for being a lackey of the Chinese, but there's nobody else that wants to give me any money to build this infrastructure, this bridge, this hospital, or that. So what am I supposed to do? You know?
Right. Well, I think no one will unconditionally give him the money to build that. Is the key. The Chinese ask less questions. Yeah. Murray, this has been just a fantastic tour of the region. And a bunch more questions are just coming in here. You've really inspired a lot of people, but we promised you 90 minutes. So I know that we should let you go, but just thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for writing this really important book. And I think all of us are, I know I'm going to read it a few more times and refer to it a lot. There's just so much here. So thank you for doing all the hard work to make this possible.
And thank you. It was a fun session. Many times when I talk about the book, they make me go blah, blah, blah. You at least let me, you know, I didn't know what was coming next. So it makes you think a little more. And you had good questions from the audience. So it was fun. This is the furthest south I've gone to talk about the book. So I'm really, I'm really happy.
I wish you could have been here in person, but yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, we'll make that happen in the future. Renata Xiaojun. So I just want to thank the Asian Pacific Studies Institute,
Yeah.
Yang Li, Xiaojun, Renata Kwan, the Duke Center for International Studies, and then of course my groups at the Duke Center for International Development and Southeast Asian Research Group for making this talk possible. Guys, well, why don't we let the webinar participants go, and then we'll say goodbye to Murray in the individual session. All right, take care. Thank you, guys.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. It was great.